Okay, we are live.
All right, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We are going to, we're welcoming our Legislative Counsel, Michael O'Grady, for a discussion of the public trust.
So this is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Counsel. The discussion is going to even be a little bit broader than just the public trust. It's about where the authority, the duties of the General Assembly with regard to regulation of natural resources and the environment come from, and how they are implemented in some respects in Vermont. Sometimes very traditionally, historically implemented, and otherwise sometimes very novelly implemented. First thing I want to talk about is the public trust doctrine. Public trust doctrine is it's an ancient doctrine. It was something that the Romans adopted to basically provide that the waters of the state, the waters of the nation, and the land underneath those waters could not be privately held, but they were available to the nation as a whole and the people as a whole, because they were necessary for things like transportation and commerce and fishing and etc. And so you couldn't privately own those waters because they were necessary for the good of the nation. And that concept has been incorporated into the law of the United States from almost the very beginning. Because remember, the United States was coming from that English system where the waters and the wildlife were controlled by the king and were the possession of the king, and you could only use them with the king's authority. And the US went the other way and went back to what the Romans had been doing. No, we're going to have the waters be the property of the public, to be used for the public for the benefit of all. But that's a very theoretical statement, because you need some entity to regulate those waters to make sure that they are managed for the good, that they are not polluted, that they're not dominated or brought into private possession ownership by someone. And so that is you. In Vermont, the General Assembly is the entity that holds the trust for the public over public trust waters and the land underneath public trust waters. You are the representatives of the people of the state, and as such, you are the ones that hold that public trust for the people of the state. With that said, you can delegate that authority to other entities. You can say this entity should be able to delegate and to manage waters, the public trust waters, for the good of the people. And you have done that. For example, you have delegated to the Agency of Natural Resources the authority to regulate encroachments on public trust waters. And that specific authority I've listed here, 29 VSA section 401, where it states that the lands and ponds, which are public waters of Vermont, and the lands lying thereunder are a public trust. And it's the policy of the state that these waters and lands shall be managed to serve the public good. And that duty is delegated to the Department of Environmental Conservation to regulate what extends onto, over, under lakes. That's what an encroachment is. Anything that extends past the shoreland into, over, or under the water. So docks, wires, cables, anything of that kind. But you haven't delegated all of your authority, your public trust authority. You still have the public trust, or hold the public trust for certain lands around the state, and the most notable of which is the Burlington Harbor, where Echo is, where the ferry comes in. That is all filled land, and filled land is where public trust waters used to be. and it still retains possession or ownership in the state. But every time that anyone wants to use the Burlington waterfront lands for something other than what you've already authorized, they have to come to you and you have to pass a law to authorize that. And it literally is, we have gone down to like the parking lot level, like the parking lot here, north to here, west of the train tracks, and authorize certain uses of that land because that is your discretion. That is your authority to control those lands because those lands were in the public trust and you've never delegated those lands to anyone. The city of Burlington would love if you delegated the use of those lands to them and they would then be the ones to manage how that they were used, but you haven't done that yet. Although you could if you wanted to.
Yet, do you anticipate?
What was that?
You said yet, do you anticipate a change?
And so when you are regulating surface waters in the state, the water quality, their uses, basically their use for wildlife, basically what you are regulating is that public trust and whether or not that water is available to the public for all of its basic uses, because there are traditional uses of the water which are reflected in the Vermont water quality standards. And it is things that you can are intuitive, like travel and recreation, and things that may not be intuitive, like aesthetics and irrigation of agricultural land. Those are all the traditional uses of the water, and generally states manage their surface waters, their public trust waters, to those traditional uses. And in some states, the traditional uses include things that you might not think are traditional uses, like mining, where water was used as a major part of a mining operation. States have incorporated water as mining as a traditional use of waters. That's all up to you again as the delegated entity, as the entity that holds that public trust. You can designate what the traditional uses of the water are. Vermont has generally been more towards the average or the normal for what is considered a traditional use. But there are states out there that have different types of traditional uses because their General Assembly decided that they wanted the waters to be used for those various purposes.
Of Austin.
When does the Army Corps of Engineers come in to this conversation? Because my understanding in being in Colchester, they can approve hundreds of moorings on the water. Or they're the ones that do approve.
So the Army Corps of Engineers has two major authorities for regulation of waters. One is called the Rivers and Harbors Act, and they regulate barriers to navigation. And so anything that's in a navigable water that's a barrier or could be a barrier, the Corps has some authority over the permitting of that. But mooring fields are an entirely weird thing because on certain waters, the US Coast Guard can designate an area as basically a mooring park. And they can delegate the authority to regulate those moorings to a town, which they have done in right off of Senator Mazza's old Senator Mazza's store. Can't remember exactly what that road is.
Yeah.
But that road north in that whole bay is regulated by the town, the mooring field. So that's the only one that the Coast Guard has designated, to my knowledge. But then the second way the Corps comes into play is they have authority under the Federal Clean Water Act under what are called 404 permits. And when there's going to be an activity in a wetland, a federal wetland, dredging, side casting, redevelopment of that wetland, that's when the Corps must permit the activity in a federal wetland. So in Vermont, you might need a federal wetland permit and the state wetland permit for the same activity on the same lands.
But I guess I didn't maybe follow the link. You said the, sorry, not the Corps, but
The Coast Guard,
Coast Guard can delegate the authority to a town to manage a mooring, but it was the Corps, you said, that was responsible for the navigable water.
the Corps regulates barriers to navigation. And where there's been a determination that a mooring field isn't going to be a barrier to navigation,
Then the guard.
Coast Guard can designate an area as.
It's just such a weird thing. Why wouldn't the Corps designate it?
Because the Coast Guard has that authority over. It's really, they're the on the water enforcement for barriers to navigation. And so that's why they were given that authority. And it's weird, and I'm probably misstating some of it because it's not an easy thing. Because technically, you can, in a water, drop a mooring or a float that's 5 by 5, and you don't need a permit for it. And the people in Shelburne Bay hate that. Because people have dropped either like duck floats or just docks off of their property, and they're saying that that's their property and that people can't do that. And that's not the case.
5 by 5, up to 5 by 5.
Up to 5 by 5. So.
But they have to take them out.
They have to, right, you have to remove that in the winter when it's time to remove it. So moving on from there, there's also a public trust in wildlife. You will see in the Vermont Constitution that it grants persons the right to hunt and fish on lands unless those lands are enclosed. And the way that enclosure has been defined is the posting statute. You have to annually put up signs, you have to register with your town that you are prohibiting the hunting or fishing or trapping on that property, or you're only allowing it by permission only. And that's technically enclosure of the land to keep people off of it and to prevent them from exercising their constitutional right to hunt and fish on any lands not enclosed. People used to say that that was the public trust designation of wildlife. And I never agreed with that. I think there's a common law authority, public trust authority of the General Assembly to manage the wildlife for the benefit of its people. And the right to hunt and fish is kind of an offshoot right from that. But it doesn't really matter because in statute about 10, 12 years ago, in the feet to moose times, you basically said that the policy for the management of the wildlife of the state, the ferae naturae, which is the Latin phrase, and probably butchering the pronunciation, is they are to be managed for the people of the state and held in trust for the people of the state. That again is your authority. You hold that authority. You had delegated that authority to two entities, one to the commissioner to manage all fish and wildlife and lands for the benefit of the people. But you've also, and you can see that, you'll see the policy in 10 VSA 4081, Fish and Wildlife of Vermont are held in trust by the state for the benefit of the citizens shall not be reduced to private ownership. You didn't have that statement prior to Pete the Moose, so there was an argument about whether or not a person could take possession of wildlife. Now it's clear that a person cannot take possession of wildlife. They can rehabilitate wildlife, but they need a rehabilitator license in order to do that. So you, the state of Vermont, in its sovereign capacity, holds those wildlife as a trustee for the citizens of the state and shall have the ownership, jurisdiction, and control of all those fish and wildlife. You then delegate it to the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, the authority to manage and regulate them for the public. And then in a separate statute, you delegate to the Fish and Wildlife Board the authority to adopt rules for the taking of fish and wildlife. So the commissioner has the commissioner's own rules and the board has its rules. The board's rules are related to the taking of fish and wildlife. And the commissioner's rules are related pretty much to everything else. Use of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Fish and Wildlife land, fishing access areas, threatened and endangered species, trade in covered animal parts, et cetera, et cetera. So those things that aren't related to the taking of fish and game. But you can set whatever policy that you want in statute, and that statute would control over either the board's rules or the commission's rules, because statute controls over rules.
Representative Bartholomew.
When you refer to wildlife, is the assumption there that it's endemic? Like if you have your property, it's not posting, you have gazelles there, they're not endemic, are they wildlife?
So,
They're certainly not domesticated.
which wildlife are you speaking of?
Some African antelope, I don't know.
An example, you don't have any gazelles, do you?
I don't know, not that I can admit to. No, I don't have any gazelles.
So the way that wildlife is defined in 10 VSA 4001, it's specific to the type of animal. White-tailed deer, turkey, black bear. It doesn't allow for an expansive interpretation of what is wildlife. Especially the definition of big game. Here,
So practically, this would,
why don't I
apply
find
to-
that definition? Because it does apply to all wildlife. But it's not so expansive as to allow for water buffalo. Water buffalo are livestock in Vermont. Because there used to be a water buffalo farm. And I wish they were still here. They make great yogurt. So wild animals or wildlife are all animals, including birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles, other than domestic animals, domestic fowls, domestic pets. So it's expansive, but when you look at the definition of what a domestic animal is, and a domestic animal is basically livestock or domestic pet, it doesn't allow for that expansion to like crocodiles. And the department has what's called the red list and the green list. And if it's on the red list, you cannot bring it into the state. Elephants, alligators, hedgehogs, although I think they let some hedgehogs in. I think for a while you couldn't have a hedgehog, and so it was like contraband, but then they allow hedgehogs in. And they will go and get things that are our red list. They did a stakeout of a pet shop one time and got some turtles. And they found out that one of the turtles that the pet shop was actually babysitting for someone else. It was a girl that was on vacation, and they took the turtle and they didn't give it back. And the girl was distraught that her pet had been basically confiscated as contraband. And it was a big deal. So they have the red list. If it's on the red list, it's not allowed.
Bringing up some questions I'm not even.
So that's basically the Fere Naturae and the trust in that. We've largely delegated to the commissioner and the board, but you always have that superseding statutory authority to designate or dictate what you believe is the proper policy for the management of fish and wildlife in the state, and that would take precedent over what the board or the commissioner did. The other public trust authority you have was one you entirely created, and that was the public trust in groundwater. There was no common law public trust. There was no, in groundwater, there was no Roman, edict that it was drawn from. This is something that you did entirely as a body. Because groundwater law across the nation is different. It's very different, especially out west, than to what it is in the east. And generally in the east, it's supposed to be managed for multiple uses and for the public benefit. But that's not the public trust. It never really, that policy never really took possession of the water for its use. Designating groundwater as a public trust, when you apply the traditional public trust concepts to it, means that the state holds it for its citizens and needs to manage it for its citizens. The problem with how you did that is you put it in a purpose section of a chapter about groundwater, and it was kind of intentionally left ambiguous. And that let the courts decide what it meant. And what the courts decided it meant is that every action that is going to potentially affect groundwater needs to have some review of its impact on groundwater. And that meant that ANR had to revise all of its rules to incorporate a groundwater component. And then they adopted something called the groundwater strategy, which is how they basically ensure that any action that they permit is not going to affect groundwater. Now, you have exempted certain things from that, like agriculture, public safety, firefighting. But those things that aren't exempted, the activity, pretty much any development, anything that ANR regulates by its rules has to have that analysis of how it's going to affect groundwater so that the public trust in it isn't harmed.
Representative Austin.
Yep. Do we have that for private septic systems?
The septic system rule has that component in it to look at how it is going to affect groundwater. And if you get to if I don't know why you would want to, but if you ever got into like trying to learn what the wastewater system and potable water supply rule is, which is the septic rule, you'll see that it is designed to be protective of human health and natural resources. It is not like other states where there are just general setbacks, just distances. Underneath the ANR rule, you could have significant distances for setbacks or isolation zones, because that's what is necessary to protect the public health or the environment. It's not just a default 10 feet or 20 feet or 30 feet. It can be site specific, and it can be very significant isolation zone or setback because of the way that Vermont's rules are set up to protect public health and the environment.
But can failing septic systems, do we know if they can impact groundwater?
Yes, they can.
They can.
They can.
Okay.
And there's a test that they do to to test for a failing system and how it affects both surface water and groundwater. They have a dye test that they use. And they can do it over periods of time to make sure that the, fluctuations in the water table change how the result is gauged. So yeah, I mean, if that's one of the ways that a failed septic system is defined, is if it is if it's tumbling to the surface, or if there's signs that it's in surface water.
We learned earlier today that the state of New York required mandatory monitoring of septics around Lake George, and they found 53% of them were failing, which is astounding.
Is it just septic? Because one of the things that has been looked at in Vermont and attempted to be fixed is those residences that have direct pipes.
Yeah, this said septics, but maybe they found some direct pipes. But even still, if it was 53% of the systems, it's a lot of failure.
It was septic.
When a septic is failing in Vermont and determined to need to be replaced, there's something called the best fix standard. Because if you don't have the property or the replacement zone that's suitable to put in and meet the requirements of the new rules, you have to do what you can do, the best fix that you can do. Because they don't want to basically condemn housing because the septic system doesn't meet or can't meet the new rules on the property available to the home.
Representative Tagliavia.
Can you give us an idea of replacement zones? What the definition or maybe the size is, or are there different sizes comparable to size of lots?
So when a new building structure, they call it a structure under the rules, is approved for use and approved for the use of a wastewater system, not only do they have to identify where the system's actually going to go, they have to identify an area where it would go if it fails. And so that replacement system has to be designed to meet the flow needs of that structure. And so they have the entire calculus formula for determining flow and what is necessary for a wastewater system. Now, the wastewater system, the permit program runs a little bit differently than other permit programs. Traditional permit programs, you apply to the agency to get approval to do something, and the agency will work with you to approve the design and the requirements for it. For the wastewater system, all the design and requirements are in the rule. It's the rules like that big. And it's up to your professional engineer or site tech designer to design a system that meets the rule. And then they submit to A&R that they've certified that the design of the system for that location meets the rule. And A&R only reviews a certain percentage of those in order to determine whether or not the professional engineer or site designer is meeting the rule. You might think that opens up the program to malfeasance to people, but the hook is that if a professional engineer is not designing or a site designer is not designing to the standard, they can lose their license.
Mhm.
They can lose their livelihood if they are not designing to those standards. And I don't know if you know professional engineers, they can be persnickety. And so they really try to meet those requirements to the best of their ability. And they have a board of persnickety engineers that oversees this. And so it works fairly well. It's worked so well that resources have been moved out of that A&R division to other divisions, which then creates an issue because there's not enough A&R people to do what they need to do to run that program. It's like go out and see if there's failed systems, go out and review novel systems. Look at, sometimes when systems fail, it's indicative that all systems in that area are failing. And the agency then requires what's called a mound system. Mound systems are expensive and difficult to cite and difficult to design, and some of them are. And so that leads to you need A&R people to help you with that. And there might not be the resources available because it's a regional system. The A&R's wastewater team is cut up into regional offices that provide services in the different regional offices, and they might not have enough people or enough resources in certain districts versus other districts.
In the north.
Yes, that's the first I've heard that that's how this wastewater permitting runs, which is a fabulous idea. I know that I come from the aerospace industry and they do this same kind of thing. FAA delegates through organizations specifically to ODARs, organizational delegated airworthiness representatives who have that same type of capability within an aerospace manufacturing. Has it ever been considered to apply that same concept to stormwater permit?
I mean, it's been thought about and it to an extent is done, but the problem with stormwater permitting is you can never really control 100% of what's coming off of the property, the sediment or the flow. So there has to be a review of how to get that last percentage controlled. Because that's what's called the engineering feasibility analysis underneath the stormwater management manual. You go out, you have an engineer who looks at it and says, this is what we're going to do. And this is what we're going to implement underneath the stormwater management manual. And we're going to do green infrastructure to get those extra credits that we're going to get for that extra control. But even after all we've done all of that, we're probably only getting 94% of the control. And how are we going to get that other 6%? So we're going to pay an impact fee for that other 6%. And that requires A&R to come in and to look at to say, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's about what you need in implementing your engineering feasibility analysis. And so it's a little bit different. I mean, you still have your engineer there. You still have that person trying to get as much out of that property as that they can for a reasonable expense. Because if you really wanted to dig, reservoirs to catch it all and manage it, you could do that, but that would be pretty darn expensive. So you try to do what you can and then work with A&R to cover the rest.
Good, but that you don't believe that, or it's not thus far been attempted to find the scope of all that and be able to delegate that decision-making authority to professionals.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's impossible. I just think that considering all of the kind of unusual aspects of stormwater in Vermont, that I would think it'd be hard to do. One thing we already do, construction general permit. You don't need to go out and get authorization to do it. It's called a non-reporting general permit. You just have to do what's in that general permit in order to do the land disturbance, construction, whatever you're disturbing the land for. You have to put up your sediment controls, your flow controls. You have to only do land disturbance during certain times. You don't do it when it's raining, torrential rain. It's like you do those things, you're okay. There was a study about 10, 15 years ago that went out to see how much compliance there was with the general permit. It wasn't great results. I can't totally recall percentage compliance, but it wasn't great. And so you'll hear that debate when general permits come up, especially non-reporting general permits. I think the hook for the wastewater program you need people to do that. You need an engineer or a site designer, licensed site tech to design your system. You don't need a licensed site tech to disturb the earth, right? Or to dig a foundation so there's some areas where I don't know if it would translate 100% to stormwater.
Thank you.
So the other, moving away from the public trust doctrine and where you get your authority to regulate, the state gets its authority to legislate and regulate. It's from the federal constitution. It's from the 10th Amendment. Those powers that are not delegated by the Constitution to the federal United States or prohibited for the states to exercise are reserved to the state. And that has been interpreted by courts to include regulation of health, safety, and the environment. So that authority, and it's a broad authority. And remember, everything not reserved by the Constitution to the federal government or prohibited from the state's exercise, that's a big universe of things that you can regulate and that you do regulate. And it includes not just things that are happening within your borders. You can regulate interstate commerce. People seem to think that you can't, but you can. You just have to be non-discriminatory in that regulation. You have to treat those people from out of state or things or commerce or things that move interstate. You have to treat them the same as you treat those that are in state. Now, that might raise questions, especially like, well, why do we charge out of state people more for a hunting license than we do in-state people? Well, there's this thing called the Privileges and Immunity Clause. You can't treat people out of state differently when that relates to like a core economic function, like doing their job and there's a test that I don't have total recall of now, where things like whether or not you're going to hunt and fish is not considered a core privilege, and that therefore states can regulate that different. They can regulate that out of state interest differently. But when it's commerce, it's the movement of people, goods, money, etc. And it's discriminatory in effect on its face. That is problematic, and you're going to have a challenge to that. It's not insurmountable. States can design their laws to be discriminatory in effect if they have a legitimate state purpose that's narrowly tailored to achieve the purpose of the law. It can be done, but whenever you're going to discriminate, especially on its face, it raises issues, and that has come up recently in Vermont in the natural resources arena around solid waste and where it comes from and how it's managed in the state. You all know that there's one landfill in the state. There are people that would like to ban the importation of waste from out of state to that landfill. But waste is commerce. And there's multiple US Supreme Court cases, federal district court cases that say when a state tries to prohibit out-of-state waste going into a landfill, that is discriminatory in effect, or potentially discriminatory on its face. The key case came out of Philadelphia from New Jersey, and they both tried to prohibit the waste from the other ones from going into their landfills. And the court said, no, you can't do that. That's discriminatory.
Even if it's mutual discrimination?
So,
Even if you don't have the resources to support that?
so the way that jurisdictions have started to figure out how to manipulate this is there's something called the market participant exemption to the Commerce Clause. You can discriminate when you are participating in the market as the entity that you're trying to regulate. And the way that, for waste, the way that that's been played out is in jurisdictions like Maine, certain landfills in upstate New York, the municipality or the state owns the landfill. And they are managing that landfill as the market participant, just as Casella can accept whatever waste it wants to accept as a private business managing its landfill. Maine can accept whatever waste it wants to accept like the private business, and they can accept what they want or what they don't want. And there's a case called Oneida Waste Haulers versus Herkimer. Not getting that totally right, but that's a case out of upstate New York where the US Supreme Court says where the municipality has a vested interest, jurisdiction has a vested interest in the management of that, just like the business did, that they can dictate what can come to their landfill or not. And they can even dictate that within their solid waste jurisdiction, that the solid waste from that jurisdiction goes into their landfill and can't go anywhere else. You will hear people tell you we should regulate landfills the way that they regulate landfills in Maine and prohibit out-of-state waste. And that's great, but you're going to have to take possession of the landfill in order to do that. Otherwise, that is a business that is regulating commerce or in commerce, and waste is commerce. And the flow of it across interstate lines is commerce. Now you can do some things to try to, as a state regulator, to try to manage that. You know, we don't want hazardous waste in a municipal solid waste landfill. We want the waste to come from an entity that has an approved solid waste management plan. We want A&R to approve where waste is coming from out. You can do those kinds of things. That's not discriminatory. It's putting regulatory controls on it, but it can kind of slow the flow. And that's what they call this body of law. They call it flow control. And so you can slow the flow, but you can't stop the flow unless you own that landfill.
Are we through your memo?
So the last thing is something called cooperative federalism. So remember, the Constitution says whatever the feds have reserved to themselves, the states can't regulate, except when the feds reserve it to themselves and say, we can't actually do this. We need the state to help us do this. And that's how they do a lot of the major environmental laws: clean air, clean water, hazardous waste, the cleanup of hazardous spills, CERCLA. There are these significant federal environmental laws that EPA is supposed to administer, but EPA doesn't have the resources to do all of it. So what they do is they, in some form, delegate to the state the ability to run that federal program. So that's what they've done for clean water. That's what they've done when you are specifically enter into an agreement to be a delegated NIPDES state. For air, you need to have a state implementation plan that EPA approves for your permitting of things that would otherwise be permitted by EPA. For waste, RCRA, they have this kind of quasi delegation program, but they maintain what's called override authority for RCRA. So if the state's not doing it the way they want it, the EPA can come in and undo what the state did and regulate it the way that they want to do it. And then for CERCLA, basically the state runs its own program until it wants to get money from the feds. And then you have to work with the feds to basically get an approved site, an approved corrective action plan. And that can take years. They're still cleaning up Superfund sites in Vermont today. So that's cooperative federalism. It can get kind of creative. The example I use of how it got too creative was the feds were trying to regulate all wetlands to the extent that they could. And they came up with this rule called the migratory bird rule. And so that if a bird documented flew from one water to another water and crossed state boundaries, then that was interstate, right? And interstate is something that the feds can regulate. And because birds were flying between all these different waters, they were like, oh, we regulate them all. Or most of them. And the US Supreme Court said, no, that's overreach. You can't regulate the fact that a bird flies in its normal pattern as something that's the same as the flow of goods in commerce. And there were arguments made, well, but people hunt. And it wasn't enough to say that the movement of migratory birds was the same as movement of goods in commerce. So that clawed back regulation of certain wetlands and was further clawed back recently as well. So cooperative federalism can get creative, but then there are those who don't like it and try to claw it back. And that's basically what I have to say.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. Just briefly, why isn't air on this list? And how do we regulate air?
Because it's really complicated.
Interstate commerce.
So first you have to realize that there's two systems. There's the US EPA system and there's the California system. And you can, if you're a state, opt into the California system, but you have to basically follow what California adopts kind of to the letter. That doesn't allow for a lot of tailoring to your own state. And there are multiple states that have done it. Vermont's a California state. There are other New England states that are California states. It's hard. It's hard to be a small state and be a California state. But it does have measurable, more protective measures than the US EPA states. And you also need to realize that you think that states are individual with their state implementation plans and whether or not they opt into California or not. But then there are metro regions and metro regions can include multiple states. where you have to meet certain standards, national ambient air quality standards. And so sometimes those NACs, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, are multi-jurisdictional. And so when and how that happens, I thankfully have not learned enough to tell you. I have always been scared of the Clean Air Act. And then my ex-wife used to be head of the Air Pollution Control Division. Now she's the policy director of NESCOM, which is the Northeastern States Coordinating on Air Use Management, which is all of the Northeastern states air policy people. For multiple reasons, I stay away from air. It's complicated. There's a lot of technical issues there. There's the California issue. There's my ex-wife.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, really helpful. I'm sure we'll have, continued conversations about this. And members, thank you, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 9.